Hello, this is the 9th video in the Test First development series, and today I'm going to talk about NUnit and configuration. So what do we mean by configuration? Software configuration is the process of giving an application the information it needs to run correctly. These are often values that are read in at startup and used to help the application get going. So examples of configuration include the database settings, like the name of a server or the name of a database or a connection string, or logging settings such as a log path or maybe the log level of how detailed logging you want, and perhaps other special runtime settings like should your application run in a special debug or dev mode. Now, in the early days of software programming, oftentimes these were passed to an application on the command line. Just as command line options you would pass to the executable. That works just fine. And then people started stashing these values various other places. So for example, many applications will read them from environment variables, which is a good way to go if you want to share your configuration among lots of applications. Other applications started sticking their configuration deep down in the Windows registry. The installer would bury that information away, which is fine if you don't want anybody to ever find it or be able to change it. But I think the most common and sort of durable approach to configuration has been simply to create a file, like a .ini, an ini file, or a .config, a config file that contains either just plain text key value pairs or maybe something a little more complicated in XML or JSON. But basically, it's just a file, often named with the name of the process you're starting, and then that process locates its init file or ini file or config file, it reads it in, and then it knows how to behave. So in the Microsoft framework, this kind of construct is supported from the very beginning of the .NET framework with the concept of an app config file. You have this concept of app settings and other settings in an app.config, and that's what we're going to look at today. Now, I do understand that with ASP.NET services, there are some new configuration metaphors and techniques that are there, and they aren't necessarily compatible with the old app.config, but I can't get into that in this video. What I'm going to show you here is how you can use app settings and have them be read in by your NUnit tests. So for starters, I've added something to our coffee shop solution. I've added a command line application called Coffee Shop CLI. And here's the program. So it's pretty simple, and basically it prompts the user to enter a menu option, and then based on their entry, it either places an order, cancels an order, checks the order status, or exits. And so what you can see is I'm using the Coffee Shop lib here inside of my Coffee Shop CLI application. Let's just run it, and you can get an idea of how this goes. So I did F5, and here we are. So I can press 1 to place an order, and it says, please enter your drink name. So let's go with our friendly latte. And let's say we're going to order 2 of them, and I'll press enter. And then it tells me my order was placed, and my order is 9059. Well, okay. Why don't we go ahead and check that order status? So I'll click 3, and then I can enter 9059, and it tells me that the order is completed. And even if I put in garbage, so let's say that I do option 3, and I put in an invalid order number, I should get one of our validation messages, invalid order. And now I'm going to do 4 to exit. So this is just a little application that exercises the Coffee Shop library. Now, looking at the Coffee Shop library, we can see that its data source, in terms of the SQL Server name and the database, they've been hard-coded in. And that's really not what you want to do. That's something that belongs in configuration. So let's go ahead and make this configuration driven. So the first thing we need to do is go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, Manage Packages for the solution. And we're going to browse, and I'm going to browse with the string Configuration Manager. And we want to install the system.configuration.configuration manager. And we're going to install that in the library. You'll see how this works in just a moment. So I'm going to install that and say, OK, great. Now, in my coffee shop, I can say using system.configuration. And now here, for the data source, instead of hard coding it, we can type something like configuration manager dot app settings, and then we can use the string to locate it. So we'll call this setting the server. And for now, I'm just going to comment out my hard-coded value there. Well, you need that in just a sec. And the initial catalog, we can say that comes from configuration manager dot app settings, and we'll call that one database. Great. So now these are going to be read in from our configuration file. Now we need to go to our application, that's the coffee shop CLI, right-click, choose Add, New Item, and the item we want to add is an application configuration file, which by default is just going to be called app-config. We'll click Add. And now we can set up our app settings. So we'll create an app settings section, and then we're going to add, and the key for our first one is going to be called server. And the value is this value that we had here. So I can go grab this now. We don't need that anymore. So there's our server value. And let's add another one. So add key equals database. And our value equals, and let's go back and I can grab this database name. We don't need the comment anymore. So now we've got some app settings defined in our coffee shop CLI. And what's going to happen is when we build coffee shop CLI, the .NET Framework is going to create a file called coffeeshopcli.config, which has those settings, and they'll get read in. So let's build this. And that worked. And let's run it. So let's go ahead and we can just, let's just check an order status. And we can enter an old order from an earlier video. And it says that order is now completed. Wonderful. And we can exit. So just to prove that this really is working, let's go ahead and change the app config. Let's change the database to test coffee shop bad. That is not the name of a valid database. And we'll run our command line utility again. And let's go check that order status. So we can check old order 10. It's going to spin for a second. Oh, you know what? I need to rebuild. So sometimes app config doesn't refresh unless you rebuild the solution. OK, now let's try it again. So we'll check order status. Let's put in that old order. It's spinning because it's trying to connect to a database that doesn't exist. It shouldn't take too long. About, I think the timeout here is 10 seconds. And, OK, cannot open database, test first coffee shop bad, requested by the login. So basically, what we've proved is that our application is now pulling, our coffee shop library is now pulling the data source and the initial catalog from app settings. They're no longer hard-coded in. So you put the app config at the kind of top level, at the executable level, not at the library level. That's correct, right? The executable reads its settings in, and then the library gets loaded into memory and used, and it has access to those settings. So here is the magic question. This whole video is leading up to this moment. How do we do an app config for coffee shop tests? Because that is a DLL. It's not a process. So this is a little bit of magic. What we're going to do is on our coffee shop tests, we're going to right click. We're going to say add new item. We're going to choose an application configuration file, but we have to name it testhost.dll.config. It has to be named that. And we'll say add. And that's because when NUnit actually runs inside the test runner, the actual application that's running is called testhost.exe. So testhost will find this. And then the next thing we need to do is we have to go and view our properties window, wherever that is. Where are the properties? Oh, we have so many windows. There's the properties window. And for the build action, we want to say none on build action, but always copy testhost.dll.config out to our output directory. And then the last thing we need to do is we need to put our app settings in there. And let's correct our incorrect configuration. So now when our tests run, they should pick up these settings. Again, let's rebuild to make sure it gets copied out there. And anytime we make a configuration change, we probably need to rebuild. And now test Explorer. And let's go ahead and place our order. We'll run our place order test, and it works. To prove that it really is using the configuration, I'll go ahead and make this named bad. And this is in our testhost.dll config. Let's rebuild it. And now when we run through the Test Explorer, we should get that same behavior where it's gonna wait for a little bit. It has to try for about 10 seconds. And then if I talk long enough and stall, eventually this test should fail. Okay. So, and now it's saying it can't open that. So that's how you have to cope with application configuration when using NUnit tests. It's a little bit of a magic incantation. You have to follow those instructions exactly, and then it'll work.